Good morning, good afternoon, uh, good evening, all of you. This is Luciano Cabral, and here I am again for another lecture on American literature. This time, I'm going to be talking about a largely anthologized short story, a humorous short story by Mark Twain, and it's called The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. I'm also gonna count on two books basically. This one again, the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume C, and the second book is Bloom's How to Write About Mark Twain by R. Kent Rasmussen. I'm gonna write the references in the description below, so don't worry about it. So without any further ado, let's jump in. Just like the frog. Let's go. Okay, as I said already, this is a lecture on The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain, first published in 1865. And before we keep going, I would like you to take a look at that picture over there. So look at that. That's the main character, Jim Smiley, and he is. I'm saying that to you because that picture kind of summarizes the whole story, especially the punchline. Not only, but it sums up especially the punchline. So take a look at that one, that picture. So we've got Jim Smiley, the main character, and he is helplessly scratching his head because he holds his frog up, and there is also a dog, Andrew Jackson, the dog, and in the short story the dog is also mentioned. And as you can see, there is something coming out of the frog's mouth, and these thing that is coming out is quail shots. So we're going to be talking about that later, but attention to that because, as I said, it sums up the whole story, especially the punchline. All right, so let's keep going. All right, let's talk a little bit about the background. Mark Twain's real name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, and he was born in 1935 and died in 1910. He was born and raised in Missouri, and this place is somewhat around the Mississippi River. The carefree and also dangerous place that Mark Twain calls St. Petersburg in his writings. Mark Twain was, when he was kind of, he was not a teenager, but anyway, when he was kind of a young adult, so he became a riverboat pilot, and he adopted the name Mark Twain because in riverboat terms, Mark Twain means 2 fathoms deep or also safe water. And Mark Twain worked for his brother in his brother's print shop, and then he became a riverboat pilot. And then during the Civil War, he wrote humorous accounts of his activities for a magazine called Saturday Post. Here again, I would like to bring once again, just like I did in the previous video, I'd just like to talk to bring William Dean Howell's critics about Mark Twain. And it's interesting because William Dean Howell says that Mark Twain's writings was something singular, different from other writers. What were the writers writing at that time? And I quote, Emerson, Longfellow, Lowell, Holmes, I knew them all, and all the rest of our sages, poets, seers, critics, humorists. They were like one another and like other literary men. But Clemens was so incompatible, the Lincoln of our time. It's interesting. He says that because especially this short story, The Jumping Frog story, is one of Twain's most famous short story. And this short story being famous is fitting not only for Twain's ability to retell a tall tale, and that's important, a tall tale story, but also because of a mishap incident that made Mark Twain advance in his career. And Twain, and that's let me talk a little bit about this incident, because Twain was invited by the editor Artemas Ward to contribute to Ward's book, Humorous, a humorous anthology of short stories. He invited Twain to contribute with a story. But Twain said yes, but he delivered his short story. The short story was called the Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. He delivered it, too late, and his short story couldn't be published in Ward's book. However, after reading the story, Ward passed it along to the editor of another magazine, the Saturday Press. At that time, as you could see in a previous video when you talked about realism and naturalism, at that time magazines were the main form of entertainment. The editor published Twain's short story because it was so, the story was so good, the story was so humorous that he decided to publish this story in 1865. And it drew a lot of attention that it was reprinted in many magazines and newspapers all over the US, making Twain known for the first time. Ironically, and that's the unfortunate or fortunate incident, ironically, if the story had been delivered in time to be published in Ward's book, it may have disappeared into obscurity, and Twain's writing career might have been other than the one we know nowadays. There is another piece of information I would like you to keep in mind when it comes to Mark Twain and the short story more specifically, is that Mark Twain revised this Jumping Frog story, more than once. And that's the reason why we're going to find this short story under some different titles, like Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, The Celebrated Jumping Frog, and The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. The Notorious Jumping Frog was widely reprinted in the 1860s because readers found it exceptionally funny. 19th century readers found it exceptionally funny. But contemporary readers might get a chuckle or two, but few, I would say, are going to find it as hilarious as 19th century readers did. With this in mind, we should ask ourselves why it happens, why this humorous story is not so funny nowadays, or not as funny as it was in the 19th century for 19th century readers. So, and we should ask ourselves why we still find it funny if we do find it funny. Taste in humor, we know that taste in humor change over time, and this is going to affect the way we deal with a story like that. However, the change of taste alone cannot answer the reason why the Notorious Jumping Frog is still considered to be a humorous story. Obviously, there are other devices such as narrative strategies, local color, language, and all of these also count for regarding the story as funny. In short, we should ask ourselves as we read it, what changing conventions and narrative strategies come into play to make us react this or that way to this humorous story. Mark Twain didn't close his writings around a literary genre. So he used to call his texts literary sketches. But he used this term slightly differently from the meaning we generally understand it nowadays. In modern term, literary sketches are brief fictional works that are distinguished from a true story because it revolves around a single incident or one event with a little attempt at complex narrative structure or developed characters. Twain's Jumping Frog story fits this definition in a sense that it focuses on only one event, the confrontation. I mean, not only one event, but everything comes down to this one event, and it is the confrontation between Jim Smiley and a stranger. Everything else in the story seems to be background information. Twain did come up with this Jumping Frog story. As I said before, it is based on a tall tale, well-known tall tale, a tall tale. Yeah, he got this idea during his days penning for gold in California during the California Gold Rush in 1849. Local storytellers told this tale, and that's what Mark Twain says, without even cracking a smile, teaching Twain two important lessons about humor. The first one is that the manner a person tells a story is what makes it funny. And the second lesson is the humorist should always pretend to be dead serious. But although Twain didn't come up with this story, he flashed it out, and these additions are he added a protagonist, Jim Smiley, a gambling addict. He also added a local color teller, Simon Wheeler, and he also added humorous anecdotes to enhance Smiley's personality as a compulsive gambler. These two lessons learned by Mark Twain are mentioned in his text, How to Tell a Story. And you're going to see that these two lessons are here. And I quote, "The humorous story is told gravely. the teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects that there is anything funny about it. But the teller of the comic story tells you beforehand that it's one of the funniest things he has ever heard, then tells it with eager delight and is the first person to laugh when it gets through. And sometimes, if he has had good success, he is so glad and happy that he will repeat the nub of it and glance around from face to face collecting applause, and then repeat it again. It's a pathetic thing to see. I also said that the Jumping Frog story by Mark Twain is based on a tall tale. So what the heck are tall tales? Tall tales, and it's written here, are distinctively North American forms of storytelling, featuring outlandish characters and events, often with comic effect. Based on oral tradition, tall tales usually focus on larger-than-life heroes and amazing exploits. They generally aim at fooling or impressing the audience using various narrative strategies. And some of these narrative strategies are hyperbole or overstatement, and that is a figure of speech exaggerating or understating a claim or a point. Another narrative strategy is understatement, the technique of downplaying the significance of the outlandish, of the extra big event, often to ironic or humorous effect. And local color, writing that brings a region alive by portraying its dress, mannerisms, customs, character types, and speech. And we're gonna see that all of these, at least these three narrative strategies are in the Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. But let's keep talking about tall tales a little bit more, because I want to show you an example of a tall tale hero. There are actually many tall tale heroes. We can think of John Henry, for example. We can think of Peckles Bill. We can think of Casey at the back. We can think of Johnny Appleseed. But I want to talk a little bit about Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan, which is a lumberjack. He has, as big as he has a blue ox. And Paul Bunyan is a fitting example of a tall tale, or a tall tale hero. And I quote, "Maybe you have heard of Paul Bunyan. Perhaps someone has mentioned his name, or you have heard a story about him come to us." Oh, I'm sorry. You have heard a story. Paul Bunyan is one of America's tall tale heroes. Stories about him come to us from the lumber camps of the northern United States. In these camps, workers known as lumberjacks cleared the forest to make room for pioneer houses and farms. Those workers from long ago may have told the first stories about Paul Bunyan. We call stories like Paul's tall tales because everything in them is extra big, extra fast, and extra wild, hyperboles. And the truth in these stories might be just a bit stretched. The heroes and heroines in tall tales are as tall as buildings, as strong as oxen, or as fast as lightning. They meet with wild adventures at every turn. But that's okay, because they can solve just about every problem that comes their way. Tall tales may be funny and outsized, but they describe the life that many workers and pioneers shared. And this is the moment we spot the understatement. The people in these stories have jobs that real people had, and the stories are always set in familiar places. The overstatement here again. The first tellers of these tales may have known these people and places, or they may have wished they could be just like the hero in the story. These stories were told again and again and passed from person to person, and the definition mentions the oral tradition, and we can see it here. We call such spoken and shared stories folklore, or we can say that we call such spoken and shared stories tall tales, stories like that. And let's dig just a little bit into the Paul Bunyan story. And this is the first paragraphs. Take a look at that. Growing up, Paul Bunyan was always big. When he was born, his first cries broke every window for miles around. And that was only the beginning. His crib was a rowboat with rockers, and his baths flooded the house until his parents gave up and started washing him outside. But Paul wasn't done growing, not by a long shot. It took the wool from a whole flock of sheep just to knit him one sweater, only one sweater, and he needed a whole flock of sheep to make him a sweater. By the time he started school, he wore potato sacks for socks and used the wagon wheels to button his shorts. Of course, so much growing made Paul hungry, and he ate 40 bowls of porridge for breakfast. And by the time he was done cleaning up, he was hungry all over again. So this is one hyperbole after another, coming after another and another and another, and that's interesting. So you can see here, so how extra big, how outlandish, and how excessive this character is. Paul spent a lot of time in the woods. He made friends with many animals, especially beavers. And here comes another hyperbole. Only the bears got mad at him because whenever they wrestled him, Paul always won. So he was a lumberjack. He was a bigger than trees, bigger than pine trees, bigger than houses, bigger than any other human being, and strong enough to wrestle and win even bears. Oh, okay. With this in mind, so we've got here the lessons in humorous stories by that mentioned by Mark Twain, the additions he made to flesh the story out, and also the tall tales. With this in mind, let's talk about the story, the Jumping Frog story itself. Okay, so the first question is, what is the plot? Yeah, what's the plot of the story? So the plot is that a narrator, there is an named narrator. The narrator is not named at all. And this narrator is asked by a friend to go to a bar room, and he is there in California. And he's asked by a friend to get some information, to try to gather some information about a person called Leonidas W. Smiley. And when he asks the story, he asks the story to a person called Simon Wheeler. Simon Wheeler starts talking about somebody else. And the narrator ends up saying that Leonidas is probably a myth. Yeah, because he can't, in the end, he can't get any information about Leonidas. And the only thing that he can think of is that his friend, this friend that asked him this favor, was only trying to play a trick on him. And I'm gonna read you the first paragraph, because the first paragraph is not only the opening paragraph that presents a story, introducing a story to us, but also it summarizes, at least to me, it summarizes the plot itself. And I quote, "In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do. And I hereunto append the result." He's going to talk about the results. "I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him, and as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded." We can see it already here, some of the lessons learned by Mark Twain when it comes to humorous stories. And take a look at that, and would remind me, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him. It's interesting because we all call this story a humorous story, but the narrator doesn't find it funny at all. Yeah. And we're gonna see that there is a kind of clash of feelings here, a clash of reception. The narrator doesn't find it funny, but we readers, we do. And that's interesting. So let's keep going. So who speaks? The second question is, who speaks here? And we need to keep in mind that this is a frame narrative or embedded narrative, in the sense that it is a story within a story here. So because the narrator starts telling the story, the first paragraph here shows us that, the second and the third paragraph as well. So you can see that the first, the second, and third paragraph, the voice is this unnamed, this nameless narrator's voice. But from the fourth paragraph on, Simon Wheeler, the second narrator, takes over the narrative, and he starts talking about that. So that's the moment we're gonna see that there is a story within a story. So a narrator telling a story, and then there is another one, Simon Wheeler, telling a story. Yeah. So a narrator talks about Simon Wheeler, and Simon Wheeler talks about Jim Smiley. So that's the reason why we call it a frame narrative, or a story within a story. So there are basically two narrators. The unnamed narrator, the one that opens the short story, and then Simon Wheeler, the second narrator, takes over. All right. So let's move now from narrators to characters. And who are the characters? So we can say that apart from the animals, the mare, the dog, and the jumping frog itself, there are human narrators. There are four narrators, I would say. The nameless narrator is a character. The second character is Simon Wheeler, the one who takes over the narrative from the fourth paragraph on. There is also Jim Smiley himself. He is one of the characters. And by the end of the short story, the punchline, there is another character coming into the story, the stranger, the con man, the character who takes advantage of Jim Smiley's gambling addiction. And how is Simon Wheeler described by this nameless narrator? And that's interesting here, because there is a physical description, and then description of the way he tells the story, and referring back again to these two lessons learned by Mark Twain. So let's take a look at the second paragraph now. And I quote, "I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the dilapidated tavern in a decayed mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance, facial expression. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him." And so when the narrator first meets Simon Wheeler, so he describes Simon Wheeler as a nice person. He thinks that he's a nice a nice guy. There's nothing else about that we can say, because it's just a physical description. What am I saying? Why am I saying that? Because it's interesting that that he is nicely described physically, but when it comes to the way he tells a story, it's something else. So take a look. Yeah? The third paragraph. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, But all through the interminable narrative, there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. So how is Simon Wheeler described by the narrator? Physically, he is described as a nice person, but the way he tells his story is described as monotonous, as he is deadly serious. He never cracks a smile. As he says here, there isn't the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, just like his voice, I'm sorry, is completely flat here. So there is no ups and downs, there is no enthusiasm, there is no excitement. So his voice never rises and never falls. It's just like dead, as he mentioned in his two lessons, a dead serious narrative. And another important thing about it is that Simon Wheeler doesn't find the story he tells funny at all. For him, it's not funny. He says there's anything ridiculous or funny about his story. And again, we got this clash of feelings, this clash of reception, because for us, okay, all right, so we need to keep in mind also that change in taste is change of taste is in humor. Probably for us contemporary readers, we're not gonna find this story as funny as it could be in the 19th century. But anyway, it's still a humorous story, and we are supposed to laugh. But Simon Wheeler doesn't laugh at all. For him, this is not ridiculous, not ludicrous, not something laughable, anything laughable. It's not anything to laugh about. And this is the way Mark Twain thinks that a humorous story should be told. Yeah. So told in order to create these clash of feelings. The narrator is dead serious, but we readers will laugh at a story like that. Yeah. And when we talked about when we defined, some time ago, the tall tale, one of the narrative strategies is, and let's not forget that because it's important, the local color. The local color is an important feature when it comes to the tall tale. And we can see this narrative strategy being used here in the Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. It's been used here. So the vernacular language, it's here. So take a look at that. I'm going to show you just some examples of vernacular language, like feller, warrant, come, any, faller, dengdest, and so you can see here this vernacular language here, this local language, and the standard language here on the right. Yeah, your right. But anyway, take a look at this difference here. And not only that, when we think of these vernacular language, we can also, and I have here a segment, let me show one segment, because it's this short story is an example of realist short story, realist American literature. And why? I would say that Mark Twain convincingly creates dialogues, dialogues which are as real as we can expect characters uttering these sentences. And take a look at this part here. It's a segment taken from the Jumping Frog story, obviously, and take a look at the way these coordinating conjunctions are used. In the segment here, we can see these and throughout the segment. So the coordinating conjunctions, the dashes also are interesting because the dashes, they show that Simon Wheeler interrupts himself. And also the underlined word, the bully rag, which is a dialect, meaning that Simon Wheeler is totally rooted in his local culture. And we can see that through the language he uses. So let me just read this segment. And a dog might tackle him and bully rag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on, but what he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. The next question is, what do these languages tell us about the characters? So it's this 2 languages, the standard language, the standard English and this vernacular English, tell us that these characters are different characters coming from different backgrounds, and that Simon Wheeler is really within his local color, his local culture, and he is a local color character. So through the vernacular language, Mark Twain is telling us that there is local color here, that this tall tale is full, and it is full of local color, especially when Simon Wheeler comes in and takes over the narrative. All right, let's keep going. And how is Jim Smiley described by Simon Wheeler? Yeah, and he is described as deeply addicted a gambler. Yeah, he is addicted to gambling. He gambles on, he bets on anything. So it's said here when the character Simon Wheeler describes Jim Smiley, and he says, anyway, this is 4th paragraph. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about, always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If you could get anybody to bet on the other side, if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so's he's got a bet, he was satisfied. So, and so later on he says that if there was a dog fight, he would bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he would bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he would bet on it. Why? If there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet to you which one would fly first. And keep going. He says that, or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parsons Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And so he was you and a good man. And by the end of this paragraph, Simon Wheeler tells an anecdote about Simon Parson Walker and his wife, because one fine day, Jim Smiley goes to Walker's house, and there, he learns that his wife is sick, is on deathbed, and she is pretty sick, and that's the moment that we realize how addicted Jim Smiley is. Parsons Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he came in and Smiley up and asked him how she was. And he said she was considerable better. Thank the Lord for his infinite mercy. And coming on, so smart that with the blessing of providence should get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'll ask 2.5, she don't anyway. So there is in this paragraph, so Jim Smiley is described as a real addicted man, addicted to gambling, and he could even bet on somebody else's lives, especially somebody else's life, especially somebody who somebody's wife, a person that Jim Smiley holds dear, just like Parson Walker. And not only that Jim Smiley is fully addicted, not only this description shows us that, but also that Jim Smiley is not regarding, he doesn't regard even people's lives. He would bet even on people, not only on things, but also even on people. And he couldn't even hold back the fact that he was betting on betting with Parson's wife, Parson Walker, against Walker's own wife, and he could even notice how I would say how bad, and how upset this would be to Walker, especially because his wife was, pretty sick. All right, let's move on. And where does the narrator's humor come from? And I would say that this humor, comes from the additions, and that's interesting. Although I said in the beginning that everything else that these sketch comes down to one event, a single event, and one event only, which means the confrontation between Jim Smiley and the stranger. And this and everything else seems to be background information, but it is actually this background information that makes this story as funny as it should be, in my opinion, because we can see a lot of hyperboles here. If we think of what Simon Wheeler talks about the mayor, the dog who is who has feelings, is a sentimental, and he dies because he can't fight another dog because the other dog he fights against has no hind legs, and he dies because of that. A sentimental dog. It's a hyperbole. And the jumping frog itself. The jumping frog is a frog that we expect that frogs instinctively know how to jump, but this frog can jump, and Jim Smiley spends 3 months teaching the frog how to jump. And then so he keeps on saying that this frog can jump higher than any frog in Calaveras County. And this is the moment that the stranger, the con man, so comes into the story. And it's also funny, although it was funnier in the 19th century than now. So the names of the pets, for example, the pup is called Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, if I'm not mistaken, was the 7th president of the United States. So there's something, there is a kind of political joke here being told. Something's like, but it's a joke in a way. And even the frog, the frog's name is Daniel Webster, and Daniel Webster was another politician in the 19th century US. But obviously this is background information, so if we don't know anything about that, you wouldn't laugh at all. So keep this kind of things in mind. But the humor also comes from the punchline. And the punchline is that Simon Wheeler is so addicted to gambling, so addicted to bet on anything, even on somebody else's wife who is, fatally, I would say, sick, that he can't see how naive he is, or he couldn't even realize that this stranger was taking advantage of him. And that's the last part. The punchline, as I said, the punchline, that picture in the beginning of the lecture, I asked you to take a look at and paying attention to it, because it summarizes especially a punchline, the whole story, but especially a punchline. So take a look at that. This is a paragraph by the end of the short story. Now, if you're ready, and this is the moment that Jim Smiley and the stranger are about to get a contest, and Jim Smiley goes to the swamp to find a frog for the stranger, and then they are gonna compete. So because Jim Smiley says that his frog jumps the highest, and because of that can beat any frog in Calaveras County. So, and with this in mind, let me quote this paragraph here. Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Daniel Webster, the frog's name, with his forepaws just even with Daniel's, and I'll give the word. Then he says, 1, 2, 3, get. And him and the feller touched up the frog from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively. But Daniel gave a heave and histed up his shoulders, so like a Frenchman, but it were no use, like this, and he couldn't jump at all. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as a church, and he could no more steer than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money because he won the contest and started away. And when he was going out at the door, he started jerked his thumb over his shoulder so at Daniel and says again, very deliberate, well, he says, I don't see no points about the frog that's any better than any other frog. Smiley, Smiley, he stood scratched just like the picture. He stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time. And at last he says, I don't wonder what in the nation that frog threw off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He appears to look mighty bad somehow. And he catch Daniels by the nape of the neck and hefted him and says, why blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds? I turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he says how it was. Yeah? And he was the maddest man. And he set the frog down and took out after the fellow, but he never catch him. And this is the moment this story, Simon Wheeler's story is telling is interrupted because somebody calls him, and the narrator so takes over the narrative again and says that, okay, so I know that this is not gonna work out. I'm not gonna get any information about Leonidas Smiley, and okay, I give up, so I'm going away. And that's what he does. And this is the last lines. However, lacking both time and inclination, I do not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, because Simon Wheeler wanted to keep talking, and this time he would talk about a cow. I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, but took my leave. All right, so that's it. And it's interesting when we think of a short story like that. As I said, for me, the most interesting thing about this short story is that there is a clash of feelings here. I mean, related to the fact that we readers, my laugh at a story like that might find it really funny, but the narrator finds this short story a boring, monotonous. Yeah. Simon Wheeler, the second narrator, takes this story seriously. He doesn't think there is anything to laugh at, so it's not laughable at all for him. It's everything serious. It said here that he believes this story is true. It's not a tall tale. It's not something larger, a larger than life hero, and that we cannot believe in a character like that, in a person like that. So for him, everything is true. And this is interesting because it shows us, and also language, obviously, we talked about that. It shows us that the narrator, coming from a different background, coming from one background, and Simon Wheeler coming from a local background, because of that, they're gonna clash. They're gonna have different feelings. Not they're gonna have different feelings. I mean, the narrator, the unnamed narrator, is gonna be bored, but Simon Wheeler is gonna believe the whole thing is true, and we readers are gonna feel amused because for us it's something laughable, it's something ludicrous, it's something ridiculous. It is actually a tall tale. All right, so thank you very much for that. This is enough. Let's call it a day. It's okay, fine, and thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye bye.